Hi, good morning. My name is Sherwin, Approvals Manager here at Vista Labs, and today we're going to be talking about China SRRC, Market Access, specifically for electronics and electrical products, and with a focus on SRC, which is for the radio type approval. So the major conformity assessment schemes, this is in China, the CCC, or 3C, known as the China Compulsory Certification, and that is for EMC and safety conformity. Next is the SRRC, which is the main focus of our webinar today, State Radio Regulations Committee for RF and Wi-Fi conformity. And lastly, we'll be briefly touching on NAL, which is the Network Access License for network conformity. So starting with CCC, at a glance, we'll go through the overview and some of the testing requirements. Lastly, the process and other requirements. So with the overview, CCC regulates EMC safety, and it's mandatory for over 20 product categories and over 135 product types. Some of the main product types: electrical wire cables, electrical appliances, audio video apparatus, IT equipment, medical devices, so on and so forth. They have a standard list of products. So if their product is not on the list, you're actually not allowed to apply for CCC. You may have heard of CQC, and that's a voluntary certification scheme in China for products that don't fall under CCC. CCC or 3C is a conformity assessment system, and the goal is to protect personal safety and national security, as well as strengthening product quality management. It's a basic legal requirement on product safety in China. So again, examples of products under the scope of CCC: commercial industrial appliances, medical devices, IT equipment, lighting, and the issuing body for the certificate is the CCC themselves. So overview of the testing: test lab must be designated by the CCC, and it's a local test lab in China, so in-country testing is required. The CB report can be used for the safety portion of the CCC. If you're not familiar, the CB report is from the CB scheme, and it's an internationally recognized product safety certification scheme. Testing time is 3 to 4 weeks, dependent on the product and the lab availability. Samples usually 2 or more. So moving on to some of the requirements: documents, user manual and spec in simplified Mandarin Chinese, circuit design, schematics, block diagram, PCB layout. If there's family model differences, you'll need to account for that with a declaration. Factory QA, critical components list for EMC and components list for safety, internal external photos, product assembly drawing, factory inspection report. And the factory inspection should be completed in 3 to 6 months, with an annual inspection required to maintain the certificate validity. And the certificate is valid for a period of 5 years. So moving on to SRRC, which is the main point of our webinar for RF and Wi-Fi conformity. SRC is mandatory for products with wireless functionality, so such as Bluetooth headsets, products using Wi-Fi, wireless LAN, LTE. So mobile phones, tablets, laptops, they all fall under this category. Moving on to the background. In 1999, the Ministry of Information Industry mandated that all radio components sold and used in China must have a radio type approval certification. 2008, MI was renamed to MIT, Ministry of Information Industry Technology. 2010, SRRC was implemented as a division of MIT for the purposes of wireless equipment regulation and spectrum management. And presently, SRRC and MIT release public notices regarding regulatory updates. These regulatory updates, their technical requirements in the radio approval scheme, and is based on the high-level radio law. The radio law is called the Regulations of the People's Republic of China on the Management of Radio Operation. So, overview. SRC regulates the wireless RF equipment. Approval issuing bodies SRC, and the name of the radio law. And the technical requirements are the MIT notices. So below you see some MIT notices and their regulated equipment types. So the purpose of the radio law is it's a necessary resource management for the radio spectrum, provides a basis for the technical requirements, but there's nothing technical inside. It's comparable to like a EU directive, EMCD directive, etc. And the establishment of this law is necessary for the production, import, sale of radio transmission equipment. So SRC is the certification body responsible for the certificate, but in this case, unlike the CCC, there's no product category, so it doesn't matter whether it's industrial or residential. If it has a radio transmitter, then it must be SRC approved. And for SRC type approval, it is a type approval, so each model needs to be tested and certified, and does not allow for family grouping. One exception is modular approvals, which we'll touch on in a bit. So the approval process looks a little bit like this. Submission is made to MIT, if you're following on the top left, and the next step is a type examination based on a pre-application review. They take a look at your submitted documentation to determine if the radio will meet the regulations and technical requirements. If it's found to be compliant, then it will proceed. Otherwise, it'll be declined, and a formal notice will be issued to explain the reasoning for the why it was declined. So, for example, if you submit an application and there's a family grouping, they'll tell you family grouping is not allowed, and each model will need its own SRC radio type approval. But if it's accepted, it will move on to testing. So testing will be done in a designated testing facility. Applicant can choose which facility from the approved list, and the lab will be assigned by MIT. We do recommend doing pre-testing before submitting to SRC. Technical requirements are completely different than FCC and CE. So, and if you fail the testing, SRC, they won't issue the approval, and we'll have to restart the process completely. Good communication with the testing facility is important. We can address troubleshooting issues, and that can help with obtaining the SRC approval. So once testing and reports completed, the application as well as all the documents again submitted for review, and this whole approval process may take up to 4 weeks for SRC to issue the radio type approval certificate. And if that's all found to be compliant, then approval is granted, and it's valid for 5 years, but may have a different validity depending on the product type. Some products will require more than one, not just SRC, but also NAL approval, such as a mobile phone. Lastly, it's important to submit evidence of sales and proof of use. You're required to sell your product and operate your product, or else the SRC will not be approved. So this process follows the radio law, which states that radio transmitting equipment, once approved, they must provide evidence of sales, and the approval process should not take more than 30 days. And actually, the radio agency they're required to announce the approval of radio transmission equipment. So that's why there's a database online to view all SRC applications that have been approved. So your information will be public. So let's take a look at some of the materials required. Application form. To your right, that's a sample application form. You're going to need a business license, a local representative authorization letter, parts lists, components layout, photos, label, internal, external photos, block diagram, schematics, commitment form on the approval of types of radio transmission equipment. So this is committing to selling and operating your equipment after receiving SRC approval. Manufacturer certificate and materials. So this is it's information on product capacity, technical strength, your quality management system. This is relating to the production of your radio equipment. This is necessary because in the radio law, not only do you use your device need to meet the technical requirements, but you yourself as an applicant must have the adequate production capacity and a quality system that that's in order. So to help with obtaining the approval. So both of these are required. CCC, CQC, or other voluntary certificates is optional, but it definitely will help simplify the process if that's available. User manual containing overview specs, configuration, operation information in simplified manner in Chinese. And this should also describe how to display the approved radio equipment ID. E-labeling is allowed, but a description of how it will be displayed must be provided. So moving on to the testing, 3 to 5 samples is required. Test software, test set of instructions is required for the testing. And to the right, you see an example for a 2.4 gigahertz device. So for that device, you'll need 5 samples, 3 for testing, and sample requirements are as follows. Continuous transmission on a single channel with and without modulation. List of the frequencies and data rates for your equipment. Test software and instruction to set the following parameters. TX power, frequency, and other parameters. So provide the test interface for RF conducted measurement, meaning usually its antenna is removed and an RF cable is attached for conducted test measurement. You need to provide the RF test cable attenuation and antenna gain. And if the serial number is not with the test sample, then this shall be provided separately. So you may have seen that the actual technical requirements to your left on this slide, it's released in public format as an official notice. So this is actually a technical requirement and enforced upon its publishing date or the date defined in the notice itself. And these are accessible from the MIT website. So for example, on your left, you have a notice for the market power short range devices released in 1998 and later updated in 2005. And to your right, you have regulated equipment types. This is not a comprehensive list. And as you can see, each has their own MIT notice. So for example, short-range devices, cordless phones, wideband, ultra-wideband, and micropower short-range devices are regulated. And moving on with the SRD short-range device example for 2.4 gigahertz. Here we have some of the technical requirements translated to English on the left. This table shows the operating frequency range of your device as well as the spurious radiation measurement that we're required to measure the frequency range of. So don't compare this with FCC. It's completely different. FCC for non-radio products, we have to test to the 5th harmonic, and for radio up to the 10th harmonic. Here, you have varying frequency ranges it operates in, and the lower and upper limits for testing is completely different. Here we see the general requirement for the spurious emission limit. So it's important to classify and identify which notices apply to your device, as the requirements are different than FCC and CE. So just because you have FCC and CE does not guarantee that you will obtain SRRC. As you can see, the requirements aren't too complicated for short-range devices, but it does become much more complicated for 2G, 3G, 4G devices. So in the technical regulations and the notices, it also consists of the radio-specific requirements such as frequency range, transmitter output power, occupied bandwidth, and frequency tolerance. So the lead times for the testing, you see a table here. This is provided by SRRC, and the test time varies up to 10 days. Longer ones, such as the wireless LAN equipment, can be up to 10 days depending on the configuration. And even though the testing might be done during this time, the approval may not be issued until 30 days. So if the test reports are good and the application is good and found to be compliant, you receive the approval. It's valid for 5 years, and it depends on the product. So here's the certificate for the radio type approval. As I said, the radio approval process may take up to 4 weeks before SRC can issue the certificate. And it is valid for 5 years, but it can only be renewed once. So if your original certificate is valid for 5 years, again, I said it's product specific, you can renew for another 3 years for a total of 8 years. And after that, you'll have to recertify your product as new. And the renewal application should be submitted within 30 days before expiration. So based on the radio law, it states that the term of the radio frequency license shall not exceed 10 years. Any changes, so if a standard changes, or if the product changes, or if you fail to submit a renewal application within 30 days before the expiration, then the testing is required, and a new certification with a different SRC number will be issued, but the same model number can be used. Again, you're still authorized, you're still required to provide the evidence of sales, proof of use, sales record, and we'll talk about that later. So after diving into the process and requirements, let's take a look at modular approvals. So radio modules, full modular and limited modular. Let's start with the full modular. So the full modular approval, there are certain requirements that your module must meet. So you must meet all the conditions listed here for it to be classified as a full modular approval. So the module shall have its own data buffer and modulation unit. It should use an integral antenna, meaning unique or fixed antenna. Module shall have a clear indication of its input voltage, and the transmitting unit shall have RF shielding. These four must be met for your module to be classified as a full modular approval. And lastly, it shall meet all other SRC rules and regulations, and that's mandatory for all modules, whether it's full modular or limited modular. So if you have a host and you're using a module in your product, then your host system does not require a new SRC certificate. There's an exception to that, but your host should bear a label containing the statement, "This device contains the approved module," and have the actual numbers from the certificate. The radio module certificate holder is responsible for ensuring the combined system continues complying with SRC regulations. Now, the exception to this is if you have a host system that contains a 2G, 3G, or 4G radio module, then you're not allowed to incorporate an SRC certified module, and the whole system is subject to a new non-modular SRC approval, and so you're not allowed to if you have a 2G, 3G, 4G radio. As for limited modular approvals, you simply need to fulfill 3 of the 4 requirements. So the requirements are the same, but you just need to fulfill any of the 3. So hosts using limited approved modules, you will require a new SRC certificate. So a new SRRC ID will be issued, and only some testing radiated related will be performed. The new SRC certificate will contain the limited module approval modules ID information. And the host will use the new ID and not the modules. So in this case, it's the only time you're allowed to have multiple modules under the same host system certificate. So previously, when we mentioned the family grouping is not allowed, this is the only case where you can have multiple modules under the same host certificate. So moving on to sales records and filing. So the radio equipment that receives approval will require sales filing. Non-radio and exempt radio equipment do not require filing. So if you're if you are planning on selling your radio equipment but it is exempt from SRC, then you also are exempt from sales record filing. Who is responsible for the sales records? In general, there's 3 cases. If you're a manufacturer and you also sell your end product to the users, agents, or wholesale sellers, retailers, etc., then you are responsible for the sales record. If you're only responsible for the production and not for sales, then the unit entity responsible for the sales will handle the sales filing. And lastly, if, for example, company A is commissioned by company B to produce the equipment, but company B is responsible for the sales, then company B will handle the sales filing. So equipment with modules embedded will also require filing, and each selling entity is responsible for their own sales record. So different stores of the same company must be responsible for their own sales filing. And so radio transmission equipment, the sales records are subject to what they call localized management. Moving on to some of the exemptions, here is an exemption list. So low power short range devices on this list are not required for either the sales filing or obtaining the SRC radio type approval. For type 1, 2.4 gigahertz range, if you look at the short range radio transmission equipment in product type number 1, you see the 2400 to 2483 megahertz range. That does not cover the, that's everything except for the Bluetooth equipment, wireless LAN equipment. So Wi-Fi, these are not exempt. These are not covered. So everything except for those are exempt. So taking a look at some of the penalties and legal liabilities, unauthorized use of the or sale will result in fines up to 10,000 yuan, and corrective actions will be necessary. And if those are not followed, then up to 200,000 yuan shall be imposed. And this is directly from the radio law. So if the product has been approved by SRC but not registered for sale, so meaning the sales filing was not done, then correction shall be made, and if they're not, then up to 30,000 yuan shall be imposed. And there's a few other situations where there will be penalties, such as if you modify radio equipment and you're selling it, but it's not in the original way that SRC approved. And another condition or situation where you'll be need to watch out for is if you're violating the laws and regulations on the product quality management, because again, not simply does the equipment need to meet the technical regulations, but also the quality of the manufacturing needs to be on par. For labeling, let's take a look at that really quickly. Needs to have the following items: manufacturer information, serial number, CMMIT ID number, model number, country of manufacturer, electrical specification. And this information will be public. So that about sums it up for SRRC, and now we'll briefly look at the network access license for network conformity. So 3 different product types regulated under NAL: terminal, radio, and network communication equipment. NAL is regulated by the Telecommunication Administrative Bureau, which is also under MIT. General guideline is if you have equipment used in the public telecommunication networks, then you're going to need NAL. Family grouping, again, is not allowed. So each model will require its own NAL. And again, some products such as mobile phones will require both SRC and NAL. Testing time, roughly 4 to 7 weeks, and the number of samples needed for testing will vary. Some I've seen even more than 10 samples are required. Validity is 3 years, and certification time can be up to 2 months. Once the NAL is granted, you may apply to buy the stickers and labels, and the lead time for that can be also up to 1 month. Renewal applications must be submitted 90 days before expiration. So SRC, you want to get the renewals in 30 days before, and for NAL, 90 days before. Thank you for tuning into this webinar. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please send them to info@vista-compliance.com. Thank you for your time.